Hello, dear students. How are you? I hope you are well. I am also well. This is Sanjoy Pal, lecturer, Department of English, Government Rajendra College, Faridpur. Today, I am going to take a session for you. The name of the topics is Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. In my last two sessions, I tried to discuss about Sir Philip Sidney's biography. That means about Philip Sidney's and his major works and something about an apology for poetry. Then we discussed the theme of an apology of poetry. We divided the theme into 4 parts. Those are poetry versus history and philosophy, then poetry, creation and imagination. In my last session, I discussed the first theme, poetry versus history and philosophy. Now today I am going to discuss about poetry, creation and imagination. I hope you joined my last class and tried to realize my last session, poetry versus history and philosophy. I also said in my last session to note down some point and try to realize those points. I also believe that you note down those points and try to realize those points. Today I am going to take my session about poetry, creation and imagination. I hope all the students try to realize this session and also hope that you join this session and also note down some point. Welcome to my online class. Okay, dear students, as part of the case he makes, here he means the poet. Or Philip Sidney. In An Apology for Poetry, Sir Philip Sidney provides a theory of what poetry is and how it works. In this essay, Philip Sidney gives some example how poetry works and what poetry is. This 2 point is very much important. What poetry is and how poetry works. And Philip Sidney gives some example or provides the theory. This includes a taxonomy of poetic genres, both ancient and modern. This is also ancient and modern. Sidney's influential formulation begins with Aristotle's traditional definition. Philip Sidney follows Aristotle's traditional definition of poetry, which definition gave by Aristotle. Philip Sidney follows this definition, and imaginative literary more broadly. Literature more broadly as the imitation or mimesis of reality, but goes even further to suggest that poetry is the creation of new. This is very much important to suggest that poetry is the creation of new, more perfect realities through the imagination. So we realize that poetry is the creation which is new, and this is more perfect than reality or imagination. The poet Sidney argues has an almost divine power of creation. So poet has a power. This power is creation, and which creation? This creation is divine. So we can say that poet has an almost divine power to create anything, and is able to perfect nature, through his or her imagination. So, forming a bridge between original golden nature and the fallen state of contemporary humanity. So, poet makes a bridge. This bridge between original golden nature and the fallen state contemporary humanity. So, this slide is very much important for you, because Philip Sidney tries to provide some theory what is poetry and how poetry works. In the last session we find that poet has a power to create divine thing, and he is able to create a natural thing, and he make a bridge between original and the fallen state of contemporary humanity. So I hope that you realize those points. Okay, then as the center of Sidney's an apology for poetry, again as part of the traditional rhetorical structure he is following is Aristotle's definition of poetry as imitation of reality. Imitation of reality. Sidney writes, poesy is an art of imitation. Is an art of imitation. We find this line in Aristotle's poetry. For so, Aristotle termed it in the word mimesis, that is to say a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring fraud. Sidney explains this using a metaphor from Plato. Writing poetry is a speaking picture. This is great. Writing poetry, you you realize this line. Poetry is a speaking picture. Why? Why poetry is great? Why poetry is better than other? Because poetry is a speaking picture. And with this end to tease and delight. And poetry has a purpose. Which purpose? To tease and delight the people. This is very much important for poetry, to tease and delight. So you find these things. Poetry is a speaking picture, and it uh, has a purpose. This purpose is to tease and delight. Poetry then has a broader definition in an apology for poetry than it does in modern English. It does not have to be in verse, which is no cause to poetry, since there have been many most excellent poets that never versified. So we find these things. Poetry is an imitation of art of imitation. This also said Aristotle in his poetry. Then Sidney explains this using a from metaphor from Plato, writing that poetry is a speaking picture with this end to tease and delight. So I hope you find out the important thing. Okay, then dear students, poets though do tend to speak in an elevated register according to the dignity of the subject. So speaking in an elevated register and according to dignity of the subject they are writing about. According to Sidney, poetry is a term broad enough to encompass not just Homer but also Plato, Hesiod, alongside Herodotus. It is sometimes closer to imaginative literature. It is sometimes closer to imaginative literature rather than merely the relation of fact with some dedicate end. Not only must one conceive of poetry as a broader literary category, but one must also place it in the context of science like history and philosophy, a skill that help on achieve versus action. So we find this. Not only must one conceive of poetry as a broader literary category, but one must also place it in the context of science like history and philosophy, skills that help on achieve versus action. Okay. Again, following the traditional structure of a courtroom speech, Sidney divides poetry into three kinds: divine, philosophical, what is traditionally classified as a derogate, and poetry written by right poets. The last category refers to poets who write the kind of poetry that Sidney describes and praises throughout his essay. Which types of poets Sidney praised? The right poets. Sidney liked the right poets or who wrote poetry to teach and delight the people. Sidney describes and praises throughout his essay. They imitate, eh, they imitate to teach and delight. This is important. And to imitate draw nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be. That is, they are like a weights, for they are not bound by certain knowledge, but instead reigns only reigned with learned discretion into the divine consideration of what may be and should be. Following a classical taxonomy, Sidney further subdivided poetry into heroic, lyrical, tragic, comic, satire, iambic, elegy, pastoral, which he will refer to later in his essay. He described all the items in his essay later part or last part. But these specific genres and forms should all be merely instances of the essay's expansive connection of poetry, which is defined less by form and more by content. So you find out first Sidney divides poetry into three kinds. Then in his letter of the essay he subdivides poetry, and he also like those types of poet who write writes poetry to teach and delight. These types of poet, he says that they are right poet. So I hope you find out and note down the important lines and point. But Sidney goes beyond it. Classical definition in suggesting that the poet does not just imitate reality. The poet does not imitate reality, but can perfect it. I also said this type of line, poet imitate, but this is perfect. This is reality more than real. But Sidney goes beyond classical definitions in suggesting that the poet does not just imitate reality, but can perfect it. The poet is the most excellent example of human superiority to the rest of God's creation. So, poet is compared to God. The poet is most excellent example of human superiority to the rest of God's creation. Sidney plays on the etymology of the word poet, which in Greek means maker. Poets called maker. Or okay, the other science study nature as God made it, but only the poet. Other sciences studies nature as God made, but only the poet. Lifted up with the vigor of his own invention. Poet's own invention doth grow in effect into another nature and makes things either better than nature being, plus or quite anew from such as never where where in nature like monster or heroes or simply morally perfect individuals. Through their imagination, the poet can exceed the narrow warrant of God's creation, not bound by natural laws, but rather freely ranging within the jodi of his own wit, the fallenness or imperfection of this world is both a Christian and classical commonplace. Sidney holds the poet maker the role of restorer or perfecter of his imperfect world, for since nature's world is virgin, the poets only deliver a world world. So you find out this last line is very much important. So poets only deliver a golden world. Poet makes a world which is golden world. Poet is a creator. Poet is a maker. Poet is compared. Poet's creation is compared with God's creation, and only poet poet also imitate, but not only imitate the reality. This his imitation is more perfect than reality. So Sidney says that poet's creation as like as God creation, and poet is important, or poetry is more important than other subject. And the foreignness or imperfection of this world is both a Christian and classical commonplace. So, dear students, I hope you try to realize those slides, and I also hope that you note down those points and try to realize those points. Okay, dear students, today I am going to stop here.